According to Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, Japan forever renounces war as a sovereign right of the nation and promises to never maintain land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential. And yet, paradoxically, the Japanese Self-Defense Force, or JSDF, exists, and it has, even in recent years, taken part in international peacekeeping operations. So how did a nation that publicly renounced war and the upkeep of armed forces come to possess a small but highly trained military? I'm your host David, and this week we are going to look at exactly this question and how Cold War realities resulted in the formation of the JSDF. This is the Cold War. Now, if you are looking for the best way to protect yourself and still look great doing it, then you need the sponsor of today's video, Ridge Wallet. These wallets from Ridge come with RFID blocking technology to prevent digital pickpockets from scooping up your information. Ridge wallets don't fold, they don't bulge in your pocket, and they're light with a sleek modern design. Ridge holds up to 12 cards and has an attached money clip for cash. It even comes in 30 different colors and styles, including the very sleek and stylish carbon. Switching from my old wallet to Ridge meant I was more comfortable and looked great at the same time. I can tell you it was an immediate improvement in style and comfort, but don't just take my word for it. Ridge has over 40,000 5-star reviews. Each wallet comes with a lifetime warranty, and the Ridge team is so confident you'll like it that they'll let you try it for 45 days. If you don't love it, just send it back for a full refund. Look great, support our channel, and get 10% off today by going to ridge.com/thecoldwar and using the code TheColdWar. Okay, so following their defeat in the Second World War, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy were gradually disbanded as part of the democratization and demilitarization policies that were guided by the Allied powers who now occupied the land of the rising sun. The Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, or SCAP, thoroughly eliminated organizations and customs that had supported militarism in the past or which could possibly rekindle it. One major step towards a pacifist Japan was the new post-war constitution of 1947 that replaced the old Meiji constitution. This is of course the document that contains the famous Article 9, which we've just mentioned. In effect, Japan was prohibiting itself from having any offensive or defensive capabilities. Instead, its protection would rely entirely on the hands of the United Nations. Now, this sounds like it was forced on the Japanese by the American authorities, but many sources claim that it was actually the Prime Minister at the time, Kijiro Shidehara, that came up with the idea based on the grounds that the Japanese people had lost all respect for the military that had caused so much suffering to its people, and that retention of arms could spark thoughts of seeking revenge. This constitutional pacifism was quickly adopted by the Japanese populace, and thus the establishment of the Self-Defense Force, the SDF, would begin in both a hostile political and social environment. We could even speculate that it would never have been created at all had the Korean War not broken out in the summer of 1950. Just 2 weeks after the outbreak of the war, while Allied forces had fallen back to the Busan perimeter, General Douglas MacArthur sent a letter to Prime Minister Yoshida requesting the formation of the National Police Reserve, the NPR. This was permission to establish a 75,000-man strong force that would aid the regular police force. However, its creation was not allowed to be debated in the Diet, and therefore it was more of an indirect order. The NPR was to fill the domestic security gap that had been created after the departure to Korea of stationed American divisions that had been garrisoned in Japan. The NPR had to fulfill 2 goals. The first was the protection of military installations, and the other was to aid the Japanese police in the event of civil strife, seen as a real possibility as the threat of a communist uprising was still present. As the creation of a military was unconstitutional, great efforts were made to conceal the NPR's nature, including the creation of new terminologies. Divisions became regional forces, and tanks were designated as special vehicles. The Americans, for their part, hinted on multiple occasions that the NPR wouldn't be a normal police force and would in time be equipped with artillery and tanks, to answer external as well as internal threats. Now, despite the presence of heavy weapons, many Japanese people, and especially Prime Minister Yoshida, viewed the NPR as a supplementary police resource. Recruitment of troops began on August 13, 1950, and the monthly salary of 5,000 yen proved so alluring that reportedly 382,000 volunteers showed up, more than 5 times the number needed. But while there was a huge surplus for filling regular police jobs, recruitment of officers was far more problematic. It was prohibited for former military officers to join the newly created force, an attempt to keep it clean and separate from the militaristic and authoritarian elements of the former Imperial Japanese Army. Because of this, the first 160 men that were selected for these roles came from various other government positions, largely from the actual police force. However, this method was problematic, and the flaws quickly became apparent. Professional soldiers were needed to effectively train their recruits and turn what was essentially an undisciplined mob into a capable force. So the ban on former IJA officers was lifted, and Imperial veterans were asked to serve in the police reserve. Of course, first they had to attend the NPR officer school and learn things from scratch. Meanwhile, the maritime equivalent of the NPR, the Coastal Safety Force, didn't even pretend to separate itself from its imperial predecessor, as its organization and staffing were based on the disbanded Imperial Navy. This makes sense though, given how much institutional knowledge is required for proper command of a naval vessel. Now, another obstacle the NPR had to overcome was regarding weapons and military supplies. In 1950, Japan wasn't able to procure weapons, ammunition, or vehicles on its own. But luckily, Uncle Sam was more than happy to provide rifles, machine guns, submachine guns, rocket launchers, and even mortars were to be given to the Japanese, and by early 1951, MacArthur even wrote to Washington requesting medium tanks and howitzers. This was less than 10 years after Old Dougie had been forced to surrender the Philippines to the Japanese. Amazing how quickly things can change. But anyway, training lasted until September 1952 and was largely based on translated American manuals. The training itself covered the very basics like operation and maintenance of weapons, hygiene, and other skills necessary for soldiers. The training then expanded to cover squad, platoon, and company-size operations until it finally reached battalion level. Through their training, the recruits became a dependable force, but despite this, the Japanese government was hesitant to rely on the NPR, and it was never really mobilized for public security operations. That's not to say that they had no intention of ever fielding the NPR, but only if the situation couldn't be settled by normal police forces. Now, the members of the NPR were also hesitant about engaging with the public, fully aware of how horrible it would be to shoot their own countrymen. The deployment of the NPR, even in the case of civil unrest, posed a difficult political dilemma as well. If the police reserve was successful in putting down a riot, the government would face criticism for pointing guns at civilians. On the other hand, if it failed, then the reason for its existence would come into question. Thus, its role was limited to that of intimidation and mere attendance at various public events. However, it was often used as a disaster relief force in cases of floods or earthquakes, following in the footsteps of the emperor's military that had acted similarly in past catastrophes. A month after the NPR training program had finished, the police reserve was reorganized and then expanded into the National Safety Force, or NSF. Now, plans for rearmament had already been in place since the Treaty of San Francisco was signed in September of 1951, with the American Far East Command drafting an ambitious plan to expand the NPR to up to 300,000 men by the end of 1953. The Japanese, however, were more modest, and Yoshida supported a maximum expansion to 100,000 men was what the Japanese economy could handle at the time. In the end, the two sides settled on 110,000 men. The newly created NSF was placed under the jurisdiction of the National Safety Agency, along with the Coastal Safety Force. The agency's mission was to manage and administer the forces that act to maintain the nation's peace and order and protect lives and property. So the new organization's mission hadn't changed from that of the police reserve. What did change, however, was the legal basis for the deployment of the safety force. Well, the only regulation for the deployment of the NPR was that it had to have been ordered by the Prime Minister. The NSF's domestic activity was bound by a set of laws containing various articles regarding their authority, usage of weapons, and code of conduct, among other things. Another major step towards the establishment of a proper military force was the 1952 creation of the National Defense Academy. Yoshida was particularly enthusiastic about this, as he believed it was essential for future officers to develop into sensible citizens and to embrace a democratic and liberal spirit. As such, the Academy featured a unique curriculum that emphasized general knowledge rather than specialized military thought. Of course, Yoshida wouldn't be the one controlling the rearmament process for long. His control over the process lasted only until the end of 1952. The US had come to regret their decision to disarm Japan, as relations between the US and the Soviet Union were becoming more heated with every day. In the words of then Vice President Richard Nixon when he visited Japan, "I'm going to admit right here that the United States did make a mistake in 1946. We made a mistake because we misjudged the intentions of Soviet leaders." Hindsight is 20/20, as we all know. So from 1953 onwards, the United States steadily put more and more pressure on their Pacific ally to increase its defensive capabilities in accordance with the Eisenhower administration's security strategy that relied on massive retaliation. In order to balance out military strength and an economy that could support that strength, the US turned to their allies across the world, asking them to bear a percentage of the burden of maintaining conventional forces while they would maintain a nuclear arsenal. Specifically in the case of Japan, the rearmament plans were solidified in the 1954 Mutual Defense Assistance Agreement, and on July 1st of that year, the self-defense forces were officially born. As in the case of the NSF, a set of laws clearly defined the SDF's mission, activities, and chain of command. Overall authority rested on the shoulders of the Prime Minister, effectively putting the SDF under civilian control. At that time, the ground self-defense forces consisted of around 140,000 personnel, divided in one regional army and 4 regional forces, but by August, they were further reinforced by 6 additional regional forces. The Japanese Air Self-Defense Force, though formed, would have to wait for a few more months to become operational. They did so when the American Far East Air Force turned over 85 aircraft, mostly F-86F Sabres, to their allies on the 15th of January 1955. The JSDF was now formally institutionalized and amply staffed, but still its existence lay in somewhat of a gray area, constitutionally speaking. In late 1954, Yoshida's successor, Prime Minister Hatoyama, may have wanted a constitutional revision, but between his failing health and, more importantly, not controlling a large enough voting bloc in the Diet, it meant that something like that was impossible. Since changing the constitution was not an option, Hatoyama's administration came up with a new interpretation of Article 9, stating that the possession of a self-defense force was not a violation of the law. This new view on Article 9 was of course met with objections and would be debated for the remainder of the Cold War. But, and this is the but some of you have been waiting for, it wasn't only the political world that had a say in the existence of the self-defense force. With the exception of the early weeks following the breakout of the Korean War, the Japanese attitude towards the creation of a military force was generally hostile. In those early days, the forces were referred to by derogatory terms such as tax thieves, and in extreme cases, the public even hurled stones at them. This mistrust towards the army stemmed from the past experience with the Imperial Army and the national destruction that the Second World War had brought about. These feelings had been reinforced by the anti-military wave that Article 9 of the 1947 Constitution had created. Mind you, by the 1950s, there was also a realistic view amongst the Japanese public that the island nation would need a military force to defend itself. This meant that the National Police Reserve and the later Self-Defense Force had to heavily engage in public relations to win over the hearts of civilians in their quest of acceptance and legitimacy. Although interpretations of the Constitution could be twisted to grant some legal legitimacy, winning people's acceptance was equally, if not perhaps more, important. Any resemblance to the old IJA would be catastrophic for the new military force. And the tool to avoid this and still win the people's seal of approval was the promotion of the good image of the JSDF by playing a leading role in disaster relief operations and even civil engineering projects. This strategy proved to be quite successful, as from 1963 onwards, the majority of the population viewed the JSDF favorably. It should be pointed out here that the overwhelming majority of the public that supported the SDF believed that its most useful mission was disaster relief and not national defense, and indeed cited the former as the reason why they were in favor of the SDF's existence. The Japanese people were very satisfied with the Self-Defense Force's help in natural catastrophes like earthquakes or floods, as well as its civil cooperation, examples of which included SDF personnel helping farmers cultivate rice, or the annual deployment to support the Sapporo Snow Festival. The most high-profile social cooperation mission the SDF undertook was their involvement in the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, with ground troops providing security in the Olympic Village, and the Air Force drawing the Olympic rings in the sky, which earned the SDF many points with the public. Over the decades following the creation of the JSDF, it continued to expand in both its size and operations, and became more and more accepted by the Japanese people, playing a pivotal role in disaster relief operations, and importantly, avoiding decisions and situations that would have awakened memories of the IJA and damaged its reputation. Today, its legality and constitutional right to exist is still questioned by a small minority of pacifists, but the majority of the public accepts it as a necessary evil, with some even favoring its continued expansion. The JSDF, like the Bundeswehr in West Germany, was created under a cloud of Cold War fear. The perceived threat to Japanese sovereignty by the Soviet Union and by China in the early 1950s demanded a response, and the burden placed on the United States by the war in Korea forced a 180-degree change of direction regarding Japanese force of arms. A country that had so recently been a sworn enemy of the United States and that had then chosen to disarm itself very rapidly needed to rearm in order to provide for its own defense. Japan continued to rely on the United States for its larger protection, ironically under a nuclear umbrella, but the JSDF did help to ease that burden with what amounted to a domestic deterrent force. Yet another twist driven by the Cold War. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future releases, please make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have amended your constitution to allow a deterrent force to be created to give you the ability to press the bell button. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com, and we're active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you enjoy our work, your financial support would be greatly appreciated via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. This is The Cold War Channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.